Then we have the specialist categories, ocean worlds and ice sheet worlds, where the planetary mass consists primarily of water in liquid or frozen states. Magmatic worlds and fractured worlds, where the surface is dominated by molten rock and volcanic activity. These are typically young planets still undergoing formation. I move to the next tier. Advancing into more dangerous territory, we have hazard worlds, challenging but not impossible to colonize or extract resources from. Above that, we have death worlds, where most sapient species originate. These planets are characterized by abundant and aggressive ecosystems, dangerous fauna, poisonous flora, parasitic organisms, and a complex predator-prey hierarchy that creates intense evolutionary pressure. At the extreme end of our current classification system, we have toxic worlds and storm worlds, planetary environments so hostile that they are deadly to all but the most specialized life forms, such as lithoid-based silicon organisms or fully synthetic machine intelligences. I paused for effect. Ladies and gentlemen of the Grand Council, I am here today to present conclusive evidence of an entirely new planetary classification, one that exists in only one location in the known universe, the human home system. The council members shifted in their seats, uncertain where I was leading them. I pressed another control, and the display showed a seemingly ordinary planetary body, a blue and green world with visible continents and cloud patterns. The council looked at the image, then at me, confusion evident on their faces. Distinguished members of the council, I announced formally, I present to you Earth, birthplace of humanity, a ghost world. Ghost world, one councilman echoed, leaning out of his booth to examine the image more closely. That designation sounds rather ominous, Master Scribe. Allow me to explain in detail, I said. We all understand the fundamental principle that all living beings possess souls. Sapient life forms possess what we term greater souls, while animals, plants, and simpler organisms possess lesser souls. All souls, regardless of magnitude, generate a measurable electrical field, a quantifiable discharge that can be detected with appropriate instrumentation. I gestured toward the shadows at the edge of the chamber. Mrexicus, I called out. Please join us. My diminutive intern emerged from the shadows, looking somewhat nervous to be the center of attention before the entire Grand Council. For the purposes of demonstration, I will now perform a standard soul measurement, I explained, attaching various cables and sensors to my intern, connecting them to a specialized device. This is a Gaussometer, an instrument that measures soul strength based on electrical discharge patterns. I adjusted the controls carefully. I understand that some of you may have reservations about this demonstration, but I assure you that Mrexicus has provided full informed consent for this public reading. There are no ethical concerns. The Gaussometer hummed to life, its displays flickering with data as it analyzed my intern's spiritual energy signature. The process is straightforward, I explained while the device worked. Theoretically, if we were to extract a soul, drain all its electrical energy into a power storage unit, and then release that soul back into the cosmic ether, we would obtain a measurable power charge correlated to that soul's strength, energy that could be utilized over an extended period. The Gaussometer emitted a completion tone, and the results appeared on the main display. My colleague Mrexicus here possesses a soul strength of 247 kilowatts, with a total discharge capacity lasting approximately 800 galactic cycles. The council members applauded politely. It was indeed an impressive measurement, well above average for his species. My intern beamed with pride at the recognition, standing a bit taller despite his short stature. I allowed the applause to fade naturally before proceeding. Now then, I said, letting the question hang in the air, can anyone venture a hypothesis as to the discharge capacity of an average human soul? The chamber fell into contemplative silence. I could see various council members performing mental calculations, extrapolating from what they knew of human physiology and evolutionary origin. No one ventured a guess. Very well, I shall provide you with the empirical data, I said. During my time among the humans, numerous individuals volunteered for soul measurement studies. The sample group included remarkable diversity, a deckhand working on an ocean fishing vessel, a fleet admiral commanding a piracy interdiction force, a young juvenile child attending primary education, and a corporate executive officer managing a starship manufacturing facility. I pulled up the compiled data on the main screen. I collected as much data as possible over the course of my stay. More than 1,000 individual human volunteers participated in comprehensive soul measurements. From this extensive dataset, I was able to calculate a reliable statistical average. I cleared my throat, ensuring I had everyone's complete and undivided attention. The average human soul produces a total power output of 1.8 gigawatts of energy, with a discharge duration ranging between 10,000 and 85,000 galactic cycles. I had to suppress laughter as my poor intern's jaw literally dropped open in shock. His arms went limp, and his shoulders sagged as the magnitude of those numbers registered. Throughout the council chamber, the reaction was even more dramatic. A collective gasp of disbelief echoed from every corner. Several council members actually lost consciousness and collapsed in their seats. Others exhibited visible signs of physiological distress, their species equivalent of extreme shock. Now, distinguished members of the council, I continued once the initial chaos subsided, I want you to consider carefully what this means. A single human being generates spiritual energy equivalent to a Class 3 fusion reactor core. I stood motionless before the Grand Council, my hands trembling, not from the intimidating presence of these galactic lords, but from the weight of what I had discovered. As Master Scribe Thraxus, seventh scholar of Nora and child of the Braxbaxan lineage, I had stumbled upon something that defied all conventional understanding. Honored Council, Lords of the Empire, I began, my voice steady despite my unease. I come bearing news of my recent encounter with a species known as humans, inhabitants of the newly discovered Terran Republic located in the solar arm segmentum of our galaxy. I kept my gaze lowered, unable to meet their eyes. You seem remarkably unenthusiastic about this discovery, Master Scribe, one council member observed with curiosity. Surely the finding of a new sentient species shouldn't cause you such distress? I took a deep breath before responding. My lords, when my vessel first arrived at one of their outer colonies and I broadcast our standard first contact protocols, I was immediately perplexed. Unlike every previous civilization we've encountered, the humans mounted no military response whatsoever. Instead, they welcomed me with what can only be described as genuine warmth and hospitality. The council members exchanged glances. This unprecedented gesture left me justifiably astounded. I continued. More remarkable still, they granted me unrestricted access to their complete historical archives, every record, every document, spanning their entire existence as a species. I am transmitting copies of these archives to each of you now. Please be warned. The documentation is extraordinarily extensive. I pressed a control on my console, and a symphony of notification chimes echoed throughout the chamber as the data appeared on every terminal. I would advise you to reserve full review of these materials until after my presentation concludes, I said, then paused for dramatic effect. Now, to the heart of the matter. I must begin with a statement that will sound absurd, yet I assure you it is absolutely true. The humans are impossible. The council regarded me with expressions ranging from skepticism to concern, several eyebrows raised in unison. Could you elaborate on that rather extraordinary claim? The High Chancellor requested. Of course, I replied, bringing up visual displays on the main screen. Every spacefaring civilization in recorded history has undergone what we call a unification period, a pivotal era when the great filter of tribal hatred, sectarian division, and factional strife is finally overcome. Through this crucible, whether by prolonged conflict, systematic purges of undesirable elements, or occasionally through peaceful integration and trade alliances, a species ascends to the stars as a singular, unified consciousness. I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle properly. Humanity, it appears, is the only species in all of documented galactic history to have never experienced a unification event. I activated another display, showing hundreds upon hundreds of flags, each one representing a distinct human faction currently operating within Terran space. The imagery filled the enormous screens surrounding the chamber. The reaction was immediate. A collective gasp of disbelief swept through the council chamber like a shockwave. A spacefaring civilization with faster-than-light capabilities that operates without any form of centralized governing authority. One council member sputtered. How is this even theoretically possible? I asked myself the same question. I admitted. The sheer diversity of political philosophy, social organization, and ideological perspective was staggering to behold. To conduct my research properly, I was forced to coordinate an entire diplomatic starbase staffed with official representatives from each major faction. My friends, I have existed for 70,000 galactic cycles and never, not once, have I encountered anything remotely comparable to humanity. I brought up comparative images showing humans of vastly different cultural backgrounds standing side by side. But here is the truly shocking revelation, I said, my voice dropping to emphasize the gravity of what came next. The astonishing fact is not merely that they never unified, nor is it simply that hundreds of distinct factions operate simultaneously within their territory. What defies all logic and precedent is this: every conceivable form of social organization you can imagine exists within their borders. I let that sink in before continuing. Megacorporate conglomerates with private military forces. Theological autocracies governed by religious doctrine, spiritual cults with charismatic leaders, democratic federations with elected representatives, traditional elder councils, nomadic collectives, even tribal groups maintaining deliberately primitive lifestyles, all of them coexisting in the same star systems. The council members leaned forward, transfixed. And here is what transcends mere improbability into the realm of the miraculous. All of these contradictory political entities operate in close proximity without engaging in perpetual civil war or mutual annihilation. Lies, barked one counselor, slamming their appendage on their console. Absolutely impossible, another shouted. You must be experiencing some form of neurological malfunction. Are you completely certain of your data's accuracy? A third inquired more diplomatically. This sounds not merely improbable but fundamentally impossible given everything we know about socio-political dynamics. Silence. I roared. The chamber fell instantly quiet. I had never raised my voice in such a manner before. Not in this lifetime, nor in any other. The council members stared at me in shocked silence. Forgive my outburst, I said more calmly, but I have forwarded each of you a comprehensive record of humanity's internal socio-political mechanisms. As impossible as it sounds, I give you my solemn word that everything I've described is the absolute truth. Have I ever provided this council with inaccurate information in all my centuries of service? The silence that followed was answer enough. They knew my reputation was beyond reproach. However, I continued, the political structure of human civilization is not the primary reason I've convened this emergency session. I will provide you with a detailed analysis of their governmental systems within the hour. It is, paradoxically, much simpler than it initially appears. They have discovered certain social mechanisms that make their fractured system surprisingly functional. I took a breath before proceeding to the next phase. But that is not why I am here. First, I wish to review our standard planetary classification system, a brief lecture to ensure we're all working from the same foundational knowledge. I activated another display showing various planetary types in cross-section. As you all know, we categorize planetary bodies using a well-established taxonomy. At the most hospitable end, we have paradise worlds, celestial bodies that represent optimal living conditions for virtually all known life forms. Just below those are garden worlds, still exceptionally suitable for sapient life and often the birthplaces of evolutionary development. The familiar classifications scrolled past as I spoke. I let that terrifying comparison settle into their minds. Furthermore, I need you to contemplate the following calculation. Earth, the cradle of human civilization, currently supports an active population exceeding 6 billion individual humans. Again, I paused, watching the expressions of dawning horror spread across alien faces throughout the chamber. Even the representative from the machine collective, typically emotionless, had somehow managed to configure its digital display into an approximation of abject terror. Now extrapolate further, I said quietly. Consider the residual spiritual energy of a sapient species accumulated over 100,000 years of continuous habitation. The collective spiritual imprint of approximately 100 billion human souls, all concentrated on that single, relatively small planetary body. A profound silence descended upon the council chamber. Minutes passed. I could not even hear breathing, as if the very concept of respiration had been temporarily forgotten. And now, my friends, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, imagine that same phenomenon multiplying exponentially. Billions of additional humans rapidly spreading across the stars, unchecked and unchallenged, establishing colonies across nearly 700 planets, space stations, and star systems throughout that entire sector. One counselor, a furred species from the outer rim, finally broke. He leapt to his feet, released an ear-piercing shriek of existential terror, his fur standing completely on end, and then immediately collapsed unconscious back into his seat. However, I said gravely, that is not the most disturbing discovery. The conscious council members somehow looked even more terrified, which I hadn't thought possible. I obtained additional data from a specific individual, a scribe belonging to a religious faction called the Sons of the Void. This man was simply a record keeper, you understand. An archivist. His sole measurement was 87 gigawatts of energy, with a discharge duration exceeding 200,000 galactic cycles. The council sat in deaf, horrified silence for a full 30 minutes. I'm reasonably certain that during this period, several of them forgot how to perform basic autonomic functions. This distinguished council, I finally said, breaking the suffocating silence, is why I am formally proposing a new planetary classification for our official index. Earth must be designated as a ghost world, a planetary body where residual spiritual energy has accumulated to such staggering concentrations that it represents, in essence, the closest thing we will ever experience to a direct connection with the afterlife without actually being deceased. I brought up geological data on the displays. Bear in mind that Earth began its existence as a Class 12 Deathworld, one of the most hostile planetary environments capable of supporting life. As far as I am concerned, our immediate priority must be to permanently prohibit any and all spirit seekers, telepaths, psychic sensitives, and soul hunters from entering that star system under any circumstances whatsoever. I genuinely shudder to contemplate what might occur should such individuals set foot on that planet. Another 5 minutes of processing silence followed before one councilman somehow found his voice again. And what about the humans themselves? He asked hoarsely. Surely, they must be aware of their latent capabilities. Remarkably, they seem almost entirely ignorant of their true spiritual potential, I replied. In my assessment, this ignorance is probably for the better. A very small minority of humans have learned to consciously harness their spiritual energy, and they employ it for surprisingly benign purposes, some noble, some merely trivial or recreational. I pulled up my diplomatic notes. As for the species as a whole, fractious as their political structure may be, they were genuinely elated to discover they were not alone in the universe. They were even more enthusiastic when I provided them with documentation describing the structure and function of council society. Apparently, their various legal frameworks and ethical philosophies bear shocking similarities to our own, parallels that are, frankly, somewhat frightening in their precision. It would not be a particularly difficult undertaking to integrate them into the galactic community as full member states, despite their unusual political fragmentation. They already possess most of the necessary social and legal infrastructure. What about military considerations? Another councilman asked, his voice tight with concern. What is their capacity for warfare? Technologically, they lag behind council standards by approximately 2 centuries, I replied honestly. However, they demonstrate extraordinary adaptability and strategic diversity. Whatever tactical approach you believe you've devised, they likely have thousands of effective countermeasures already theorized and war-gamed. Whatever vessel classifications you field, they have already designed 24 different ship types specifically optimized to counter them. I paused, then gestured subtly toward the upper observation deck behind me. And even beyond their tactical sophistication, the council members' eyes followed my gesture upward, and what they saw froze them in their seats. In the shadows of the upper viewing deck, a human-shaped silhouette stood motionless, watching them. It had been there the entire time. The council erupted into chaos. Screams of terror echoed through the chamber as council members scrambled from their seats, many fleeing toward the exits. A few brave, or perhaps simply paralyzed, souls remained behind, locked in place by fear, as the shadow of humanity's collective spiritual presence stared down at them with what appeared to be billions of eyes. "I didn't think so," I said calmly into the pandemonium. "I believe that concludes our session for today." I gathered my documents methodically and gently guided my traumatized intern toward the exit. As we walked, I glanced upward and found those billions of phantom eyes now focused directly on me. I looked down at the small object I'd brought with me, fully aware of what I had orchestrated. Humanity's entire spiritual realm, or at least a significant portion of it, had been present in this chamber the entire time. The object was a small locket containing a photograph of a young human woman with the initials CI engraved on its surface. This simple trinket had served as a spiritual beacon, allowing the accumulated souls of humanity a window through which they could manifest, however subtly, in our reality. A complex mixture of reverence and primal fear washed over me as I entered the elevator to return to my private study. I had known it was there the entire time, watching, listening, bearing witness to our discussion of its species. What has the universe created? I thought. What manner of being can serve so effortlessly as a conduit between the spiritual realm and our physical reality? What threshold do they cross so easily? What have the gods themselves unleashed into the cosmos? I retreated to my study, still sensing humanity's shadow following just at the edge of my perception, barely registering in my peripheral vision, present but not threatening. What have we found? I wondered. What power have the ancient gods brought into existence? I sat down heavily in my chair and placed a framed photograph on my desk. It showed me surrounded by a group of humans, all with genuine smiles on their faces, happy expressions, raised beer mugs, the warm atmosphere of easy friendship and shared laughter. I had taken it during what the humans called a pub crawl in one of their entertainment districts. I studied the photograph thoughtfully for a long moment, feeling the shadowed presence gradually dissipate as I smiled at the memory of that evening. The jokes, the terrible singing, the surprisingly good food, the absolute lack of pretense or political maneuvering. "Nah," I said aloud to the empty room, still smiling. "We'll be fine." Part 2. The Aftermath. The emergency session had ended barely 3 hours ago, and already my communications console was flooded with priority requests. 743 messages, each marked as urgent, each from a different councilman, sector governor, or military commander demanding clarification, additional data, or simply expressing their terror in carefully diplomatic language. I ignored them all for the moment and instead poured myself a glass of Centauri whiskey, a gift from Ambassador Thrix during our last cultural exchange. The amber liquid burned pleasantly as it went down, warming me from the inside. Mrexicus sat in the corner of my study, still visibly shaken, his usual bright demeanor replaced by a 1,000-yard stare. "Are you all right, my friend?" I asked gently. He blinked several times before responding. "Master Thraxis, I thought I understood the scope of our galaxy. I thought I comprehended the diversity of life and the variations in spiritual energy across species. But this..." He gestured helplessly at the data still displayed on my secondary monitor. "This changes everything we thought we knew about soul dynamics and spiritual physics." "Indeed it does," I agreed, settling deeper into my chair. "Which is precisely why I needed the Council to understand the magnitude of what we've discovered. But the way you did it, Master, bringing that locket, allowing their collective presence to manifest in the chamber itself." He shuddered. "I felt them watching us. All of them. It was like standing beneath an ocean of consciousness, held back only by the thinnest membrane of reality. An apt description, I said, taking another sip. The humans themselves have dozens of words for the sensation: uncanny, eerie, unsettling, the presence of ghosts. They've lived their entire existence on a planet saturated with spiritual energy, so they've developed an intuitive awareness of it, even if they don't fully understand what they're sensing. Mrexicus finally stood and approached my desk, his curiosity beginning to overcome his fear. Master, may I ask you something that's been troubling me? Of course. You seemed remarkably calm throughout the entire presentation, even when revealing the most shocking data. Even when the shadow appeared in the observation deck. Were you not afraid? I considered the question carefully. Afraid? No, not anymore.
Cautious, certainly.
Respectful, absolutely. But afraid? Not since my third week among them. I pulled up another series of images on my display, candid photographs I had taken during my extended stay in human territory. Let me tell you about my time on Earth, Mrexicus. Let me tell you about what those numbers and measurements don't capture. The human experience. I arrived at their primary orbital station. They call it Unity Gateway, though it serves 17 different factions, with every scanner and defensive system on my ship at maximum readiness. The protocol for first contact with potentially dangerous species was fresh in my mind. I had reviewed casualty statistics from previous first contacts that went badly. I was, quite frankly, expecting the worst. I brought up an image of the station, a massive rotating wheel structure with hundreds of docking ports. Within 10 minutes of transmitting my identification and peaceful intentions, I received 47 different responses. 47, Mrexicus. Each from a different governmental or organizational body, each welcoming me in slightly different ways, each offering assistance, accommodation, and protection under their specific jurisdiction. I had to spend my first 6 hours simply coordinating which factions representatives I would meet with first, because I didn't want to inadvertently cause offense by appearing to favor one over another. Do you know what they did? Mrexicus shook his head.
They solved it themselves.
Within 2 hours, they had established what they called a First Contact Coordinating Committee, with rotating representation, scheduled meeting times, and a system for shared information distribution that ensured no faction was privileged above another. They created an entirely new bureaucratic structure in less time than it takes most species to draft a single diplomatic communique. I smiled at the memory. And then, after all that coordination and careful diplomatic maneuvering, the first human I met face-to-face was a young woman named Sarah Chin. She was a junior diplomatic aide, probably no more than 30 cycles old by their reckoning. Do you know what she said to me? What, Master? Holy shit, you're actually an alien. This is the coolest day of my entire life. Can I get a selfie? Mrexicus blinked in confusion. A selfie. A photographic image taken of oneself, usually with another person, for personal enjoyment and social sharing. She wanted to commemorate the moment. I pulled up the image, me standing somewhat bewildered next to a beaming young human woman making what I later learned was called a peace sign with her fingers. That photograph, I said softly, taught me more about humanity in 5 seconds than 1,000 reports could have. Here was a being who had just encountered the first confirmed alien intelligence in her species' history, and her immediate reaction was joy, excitement, and a desire to share that moment with others. I cycled through more images. Over the following weeks, I was invited to experience what they call culture. I attended a theatrical performance in New Beijing, a story told through coordinated movement and music. I participated in a religious ceremony in Vatican City, despite not sharing their faith. I visited a scientific research station in Antarctica where they study their planet's climate patterns. I even attended that pub crawl you saw in the photograph, an informal social gathering centered around the consumption of ethanol-based beverages and sharing stories. And everywhere I went, Mrexicus, everywhere, I encountered the same pattern. Curiosity, welcome, and a genuine desire to share their existence with someone new. Even when they disagreed with each other, and they disagreed constantly, loudly, and with great passion, they still maintained this underlying unity of purpose, when it came to external relations. Mrexikis was listening intently now, his fear gradually being replaced by fascination. But, Master, how do they manage it? How do they maintain cohesion without centralized authority, without a unification event to forge them into a single identity? That, I said, standing and walking to the window overlooking the council complex, is what I spent months trying to understand. And when I finally grasped it, it was so elegantly simple that I felt foolish for not seeing it immediately. The great human paradox. They have something they call humanity, I explained. Not the species name, but a concept, an abstraction that transcends their individual factions and ideologies. It's simultaneously their greatest strength and most dangerous weakness. I pulled up my anthropological notes, months of careful observation and analysis. Every faction, no matter how different in practice or belief, shares certain core values they consider fundamentally human. Protection of children, care for the injured and elderly, curiosity about the unknown, the right to self-determination, freedom of thought and expression. These principles exist across every culture I encountered, even when their specific implementations varied wildly. So they do have a unifying philosophy, Mrexikis exclaimed. No, that's what makes it so paradoxical. They have shared values, but not a shared implementation. They agree on what matters, but vigorously disagree on how to achieve it. A faction might believe that absolute individual freedom is the highest expression of human dignity, while another believes that collective welfare requires structured governance. Both believe they're defending humanity, but their methods are diametrically opposed. I brought up a recording of a debate I had witnessed in the Terran Parliament, one of the rare venues where all factions sent representatives. Watch this exchange. These two humans are arguing about resource distribution policy. Listen to their words. The recording played, showing two humans engaged in what appeared to be heated disagreement. Their voices were raised, their gestures emphatic, their rhetoric pointed, and occasionally cutting. Notice anything? I asked. Mrexikis watched carefully. They're very angry with each other.
Yes.
Now watch what happens at the end. The debate concluded, and the two humans who had been verbally sparring moments before shook hands, laughed about something, and walked out of the chamber together, still talking animatedly but now in a friendly manner. They compartmentalize, I explained. They can disagree completely on policy, argue passionately for their position, even use what seems like hostile language, and then immediately return to baseline cordiality once the formal debate ends. They separate the argument from the person making it. Most species can't do that, Mrexikis observed. For most of us, disagreement becomes personal. It becomes tribal. It leads to conflict.
Exactly.
Humans have somehow developed the cognitive ability to hold two contradictory thoughts simultaneously. This person's ideas are wrong and potentially harmful, and this person is still deserving of basic respect and dignity. It's a psychological flexibility that I've never encountered in any other species. I pulled up more data, sociological studies I had conducted. But here's where it becomes even more interesting. When faced with an external threat or an outside observer, like me, they instinctively unify. All those fractious disagreements don't disappear, but they immediately become secondary to presenting a cohesive front to the outsider. It's not calculated or planned. It's reflexive. Is that why they gave you such complete access to their archives? Mrexikis asked. To present themselves as unified and trustworthy.
Partially, yes.
But also because they genuinely believe that transparency builds trust. They showed me everything, their wars, their atrocities, their failures, their triumphs, because they wanted me to understand them completely, flaws and all. They call it honest diplomacy, and it's simultaneously brilliant and terrifying. Mrexikis had relaxed considerably now, his scientific curiosity fully engaged. Master, can we return to the question of their souls? The measurements you showed the council, are you absolutely certain of their accuracy? I triple-checked every reading, I assured him. I used 6 different types of gasometers, borrowed equipment from 3 different species scientific institutions, and even had several humans independently tested by researchers who didn't know they were measuring humans. The results were consistent across all methodologies. But how is it possible? How does a species evolve with such extraordinarily powerful souls? I had spent considerable time contemplating this very question. I have a theory, though I cannot prove it definitively. Consider Earth's classification as a class 12 Deathworld at the point when humans evolved. The evolutionary pressures on that planet were extraordinary, not just physical dangers from megafauna and environmental hazards, but also from microscopic threats. Diseases, parasites, bacterial infections that could kill in days or hours. I brought up a biological analysis of human evolutionary history. Humans evolved in an environment where death was omnipresent. Their average lifespan for most of their evolutionary history was between 20 and 30 cycles. They died constantly from predation, from disease, from accidents, from violence, from childbirth complications, from simple infections. That sounds nightmarish, Mrexicus murmured.
It was.
But here's the crucial point. They died in enormous numbers, but in the same locations, generation after generation after generation. For 100,000 years, humans lived and died on that single planet in relatively concentrated populations. Every death released spiritual energy back into the local environment, where it was gradually absorbed by the planet itself and by subsequent generations. I pulled up a model I had constructed showing spiritual energy accumulation over time. Imagine it as a feedback loop. Each generation possesses slightly more latent spiritual energy than the previous generation because they're literally born into an environment saturated with the residual souls of their ancestors. Over 100,000 years, this effect compounds exponentially. So they're not just naturally powerful, they've been spiritually breeding themselves stronger across countless generations. Precisely. And they have no idea this happened. They have no framework for understanding spiritual energy the way we do. They sense it. They call the phenomenon feeling the presence of the dead, or sensing spirits, or experiencing the uncanny, but they have no scientific comprehension of what they're actually feeling. Mrexicus was pacing now, his analytical mind working through the implications. Master, if this is true, then as they spread across more planets and establish colonies, the effect will only intensify. Each colony world will begin its own accumulation cycle. Exactly. Within 10,000 cycles, humanity could potentially have dozens of ghost worlds scattered across the galaxy. Within 50,000 cycles, they might have hundreds. Mrexicus struggled to find words. That's potentially the largest shift in galactic spiritual topology in recorded history. Which is why the Council needed to understand what we're dealing with, I said firmly. This isn't just a first contact situation. This is a fundamental alteration of the spiritual landscape of our galaxy. The humans don't pose a military threat. They're technologically inferior and strategically defensible. But spiritually, they're a force of nature that we barely comprehend. The Sons of the Void. Mrexicus had returned to his chair, processing everything I had told him. After a long moment of contemplative silence, he spoke again. Master, you mentioned a religious faction called the Sons of the Void. The scribe whose readings were so extraordinarily high. Can you tell me more about them? I had been expecting this question. The Sons of the Void are one of the more unusual human factions. They're a religious order dedicated to what they call contemplative existence and the preservation of memory. They spend most of their lives in deep meditation, maintaining detailed historical records, and apparently, though I only partially understand this, communing with the departed. Communing with the departed? You mean they actively interact with souls? That's what they claim, though they describe it in religious rather than scientific terms. They speak of feeling the presence of ancestors and receiving wisdom from those who came before. Based on my measurements, I believe they may actually be accessing the accumulated spiritual energy of Earth in some directed manner. I pulled up my notes from my visit to their primary monastery, a structure built into the side of a mountain in what humans call the Himalayas. The scribe I tested, his name was Brother Michael, had been with the Order for 40 years by human reckoning. He spent 6 to 8 hours every day in what they call silent contemplation. When I measured his soul strength, even I was shocked by the reading. 87 gigawatts is more than some small starships generate. Did you ask him about it? Did he know? I did. He found the question amusing. He said, "Brother Thraxus, they insisted on calling me brother despite my not being part of their order. We are all connected to those who came before and those who will come after. The strength you measure is not mine alone, but the strength of all humanity flowing through me." Poetic, but not scientifically informative, Rexicus noted. No, but I think there's truth in his interpretation. I believe that individuals who spend significant time in meditative states may be unconsciously opening themselves to the ambient spiritual energy of their environment. On a ghost world like Earth, that means potentially accessing the accumulated energy of billions of souls. Rexicus paused, considering. That's actually terrifying, Master. If humans could consciously harness that energy, they would be perhaps the most powerful psychic force in the known galaxy, I finished. Which is why I was very careful in my report to note that they seem largely ignorant of this capability and that the few who do access it use it for benign purposes. But what if that changes? I met his gaze seriously. Then we will need to have already established strong diplomatic and cultural ties with them to ensure that any such development occurs within a framework of mutual understanding and cooperation. Which is why integration into the galactic community, despite the unprecedented nature of their political structure, is absolutely essential. The long view. Rexicus was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him working through the massive implications of everything I had shared. Finally, he asked the question I had been waiting for. Master Thraxus, why did you really bring that locket into the council chamber? Why did you allow their spiritual presence to manifest? You could have simply presented the data without that dramatic demonstration. I smiled, recognizing the intelligence behind the question. Because data alone wouldn't have been enough, my young friend. The council needed to feel what I felt. They needed to understand viscerally, not just intellectually, what we're dealing with. I picked up the locket from my desk, opening it to reveal the picture of the young woman, Clara Ironwood, a historian I had befriended during my stay in the human city they call London. This locket belonged to her great-great-grandmother. It's been passed down through 5 generations of her family. When she gave it to me, alone she insisted, to be returned when I visit again, she told me it would keep me safe. She said her grandmother's spirit would watch over me. And you believe it does? I know it does. I've felt it. That presence that followed me from the council chamber? It's been with me since Clara gave me this locket. Not threatening, not controlling, just present. Watching. Protective. That should be terrifying, Rexicus said quietly. It should be, I agreed. But it isn't. Because I understand now what the humans instinctively know. Their dead don't leave them. The spiritual energy of every human who has ever lived remains, in some form, part of their collective existence. They're never truly alone. They're never truly without guidance from those who came before. I closed the locket gently. And when I brought this into the council chamber, I brought a window through which humanity's collective spiritual presence could observe us. I wanted them, both the living and the dead, to see our grand council. To see that we approach them with respect and careful consideration. To see that we recognize their significance. You are sending a message, Rexicus realized. I was sending a message to both sides. To the council. Understand the magnitude of what we've found. And to humanity's collective spirit. We see you, we acknowledge you, and we come in peace. Rexicus stood and walked to the window, looking out over the vast council complex, the administrative heart of galactic civilization. Master, what happens now? After today's presentation, after the panic and the fear and the Council's likely attempts to restrict or control human expansion. Now, I said, joining him at the window, comes the most critical phase. The Council will want to establish protocols, restrictions, observation frameworks. They'll want to treat humanity as either a threat to be contained or a resource to be exploited. Neither approach will work. Why not? Because humans don't respond well to either containment or exploitation. Pressure them too hard, restrict them too obviously, and you'll unite every one of those fractious factions against you. Try to exploit them, and you'll discover that for all their internal disagreements, they become absolutely ruthless when defending each other from external threats. So, what do you recommend? I turned to face him fully. Partnership. Genuine, honest partnership. Share our knowledge with them. Learn from their unique perspective. Allow them to integrate into galactic society on their own terms, at their own pace. Yes, establish some sensible precautions. Keep psychically sensitive species away from their ghost worlds until we better understand the effects. Monitor their spiritual development. But do it all transparently, with their full knowledge and cooperation. You think they'll accept that? I know they will. Because despite all their power, despite their impossible political structure, despite their terrifying spiritual potential, the humans fundamentally want one thing above all else: to not be alone in the universe. They want to learn, to grow, to share, and to be part of something larger than themselves. I returned to my desk and began composing my formal recommendations to the council. The humans are impossible, Mrexicus. They shouldn't exist, shouldn't function, shouldn't be as powerful as they are. But they do, and they are. And we have a choice. We can fear them and create the very conflict we wish to avoid, or we can embrace them and potentially gain the most valuable allies our civilization has ever known. Mrexicus nodded slowly. I understand, Master. And I think I'm no longer afraid. Good, I said with satisfaction. Because tomorrow, you're going to help me draft the formal integration proposal. We're going to ensure that humanity's entry into galactic society is smooth, beneficial to all parties, and establishes the foundation for a lasting partnership. One more question, Master? Of course. That pub crawl you mentioned. The one in the photograph. What's it actually like? I laughed. The first genuinely carefree sound I'd made since returning from human space. It's chaotic, loud, undignified, and absolutely wonderful. Humans have this remarkable ability to find joy in the simplest things: good food, good drink, good company, and terrible singing. Terrible singing? Spectacularly terrible. They know it's terrible. They do it anyway because it makes them happy. That, Mrexicus, might be the most important thing I learned about humanity. They choose joy even especially when circumstances don't demand it. They laugh at their own absurdity. They celebrate the mundane. They find meaning in moments that most species would consider trivial. I looked at the photograph again, at those smiling faces, those raised glasses, that moment of pure, uncomplicated friendship. That's why I'm not afraid of them, despite their power. Because ultimately, they're not interested in domination or conquest. They're interested in the next great joke, the next fascinating discovery, the next person to share a drink with. The ghost world spawned beings of immense spiritual power, yes, but it also spawned beings who would rather share that power than hoard it. Mrexicus smiled, finally understanding. We'll be fine. Yes, I agreed, raising my glass of Centauri whiskey in a solitary toast. Yes, we will. Outside my window, the lights of the council complex glittered against the darkness of space, and somewhere in that vastness, billions of humans continued their impossible existence, arguing, laughing, creating, and slowly, inevitably, changing the spiritual destiny of the entire galaxy. And I, Master Scribe Thraxus, the seventh of Nora, child of the Braxpaxan, had been privileged enough to witness the beginning of that transformation. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Epilogue, a message received. 3 days after the presentation, as I was finalizing my integration proposal, my personal communications console chimed with an incoming transmission. The origin coordinates made me sit up immediately. Earth, human space, direct from Unity Gateway. I accepted the transmission, and Sarah Chen's face appeared on the screen. That same brilliant smile I remembered from our first meeting. Master Scribe Thraxus, she said warmly. I hope this message finds you well. We heard about your presentation to the Grand Council. Word travels fast in diplomatic circles, even across species barriers. I felt a momentary surge of embarrassment. I hope my characterization of your people was accurate and respectful, Ambassador Chen. Ambassador now, is it? She laughed. I got promoted after you left. Apparently, successfully not causing an interspecies incident earns you a raise. And yes, from what we've heard through unofficial channels, your presentation was memorable. That is one word for it, I admitted. Her expression turned more serious, though the warmth never left her eyes. Thraxus, I want you to know something. We understand what you did, and why you did it. Showing them our power, making them feel our presence, it wasn't about intimidation. It was about ensuring they took us seriously, that they understood we're not something to be dismissed or casually exploited. You knew. Clara Ironwood is my cousin, Sarah said with a knowing smile. When she lent you her grandmother's locket, she knew exactly what you intended. We all did. The living and the dead both approve of your methods, Master Scribe. You honored us by showing them the truth of what we are. I felt the weight of that statement settle over me. Your people continue to surprise me, Ambassador.
Good.
That means we're doing it right. She glanced at something off-screen. I have another reason for calling. The Terran Coordinating Committee has reviewed the preliminary integration frameworks, and we'd like to formally request that you serve as our primary liaison to the Grand Council. We trust you, Thraxus. You see us clearly, both our potential and our limitations. I would be honored, I said, and meant it completely. Excellent. Oh, and one more thing. We're organizing another pub crawl next month. Consider this your official invitation. Mrexikis is welcome too. We make a pretty decent non-alcoholic variant for species, with different biochemistry. After the transmission ended, I sat in thoughtful silence. Mrexikis poked his head into my office. Good news, Master? The best possible news, I replied, looking at the locket on my desk. Humanity has extended the hand of friendship, and we would be fools not to take it. The shadow in the corner of my vision seemed to pulse with approval, and for the first time since leaving Earth, I felt truly at peace with what was to come. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. But tonight, I allowed myself to hope for a future where humans and the rest of galactic civilization would grow together, learning from each other, protecting each other, and perhaps, just perhaps, becoming something greater than either could achieve alone. The ghost world had given birth to something impossible. Now it was time to see what miracles that impossibility might create.